right, we are live.
Okay. Good afternoon. Welcome to the Tompkins County, New York Office of Human Rights Pride Month program toward common ground, Black and white LGBTQ plus folk on collaboration for racial and queer justice. We welcome colleagues and participants from our Ithaca and Central New York community, and colleagues who are members of GARE, the Government Alliance on Race and Equity, a national organization of which Tompkins County is a member. I am Ken Clark, Director of the Tompkins County Office of Human Rights. I will be moderating today's program. I wanted to give my thanks to Dominic Recchio, Tompkins County Director of Communications, who is managing the technical aspects of today's program. Today we have three panelists, including Ulysses Smith, Head of Diversity, Inclusion, and Belonging at Blend, a leading digital platform for mortgages and banking; Shauna Black, Vice Chair of the Tompkins County Legislature and an LGBTQ plus activist for 25 years; and Ann Corman, Tompkins County Legislator and Chair of the Workforce Diversity and Inclusion Committee of the Legislature, and co-founder of Finger Lakes Pulse, an LGBTQ plus advocacy group. Regrettably, our scheduled fourth speaker, the Reverend David North, is unable to join us today. His husband, also named David, is ill. And as a friend whom I met 40 years ago when we were students at Colgate-Rochester Crozer Divinity School, my personal prayers are with David and his husband during this time. Our format for the salon is this. In our hour together, each speaker will address the topic of our discussion for 5 minutes. Then we will open to discussion from participants. We ask that you would send your questions and answers through the function that is available to you through Microsoft. The reason we are gathered together: global protests sparked by the murder of George Floyd by Minneapolis, Minnesota police have highlighted the necessity for all people of goodwill to combat the institutional and systemic racism reflective in too many tragic encounters between Black people and law enforcement. These protests also implicate the intersections of race, gender identity, and sexual orientation, and the intersection of common challenges faced by people of color and LGBTQ plus persons. They also reveal the overlooked history and contemporary reality of LGBTQ plus contributions to social justice and the leadership of people of color in the pursuit of queer justice. How can this history and contemporary reality serve as a foundation for coalition building to address racism, homophobia, and transphobia? Our first speaker is Ulysses Smith of Blend, located in the financial district of San Francisco. He is a 2014 graduate of Cornell. I knew him there as a student activist, where he worked after graduation as a lead diversity and inclusion strategist and Title IX coordinator, and later as a lead for special projects and strategic development. The next two colleagues that will speak are colleagues from the county legislature. Shauna Black is the chair of the Health and Human Services Committee of the legislature. Shauna and her wife, Margot, were part of the historic Ithaca 25 couples, I should say, who sued New York State in 2004 for the right of gay and lesbian couples to marry. Shauna and Margot were married in 2015. She is joining us on the road traveling back to Ithaca. Ann Corman is our third and final speaker, a longtime social justice and environmental activist. She has written about how her experience of growing up in an environment that fostered homophobia, white privilege, and racism has informed her current commitment to diversity and inclusion. We will lead off our discussion with Ulysses.
Well, thank you for the wonderful introduction, Reverend Clark, and I am extremely grateful to be returning back to Ithaca again virtually after calling it home for about 8 long winters, because that's how you measure time in Ithaca. The native, the Floridian in me, that's how I measure time. But this has been, for me, an extraordinarily difficult period. It's been eye-opening in many respects. And I'm grateful that we're assembling now to have this conversation and to talk specifically kind of about a coalition building in this respect. Um, for me, learning about who I am is a daily growth exercise. I find that I learn something new about myself every day. Some of those things I don't always like, but I do learn something new about myself every day. One of the things I have known for years is that I am unapologetically Black and unapologetically gay.
Mhm.
That is who I am. That is who I will always be, and I grow more comfortable in my skin every single day. But that was a journey to get to this point. It's been a very long journey to get to this point. And I wish I could say it was easy and I had, an easy coming out story at that time, but that's just not necessarily the case. And I think when we're in the midst of talking about Pride Month and the history of activism within the queer community, and of course looking at the landscape right now, particularly as it pertains to Black people in the United States, we have a lot of work to do. And it's been very easy for me and maybe for many others who are watching to fall into this narrative, right? The dominant narrative that we're all susceptible to of white supremacy, right? And so to separate that out for folks, that's an ideology, right? That's a belief, right? That the culture, the belief systems, the values, the contributions of white people are superior to other people. And we see that influence so many different parts of our lives, even when we don't realize it. We see it when we look in the queer community, when we talk about a lot of the narrative around beauty standards, when we look at a lot of the narrative around who's attractive in the queer community or what gay even looks like, right? And it's typically the image you typically see are probably not anything close to the three people on this panel, right? That's just kind of the reality of the mainstream. And I think this is an opportunity for us to start to challenge that and examine some of our own biases that come along with that. Now, I want to be clear in saying that I think the first thing that we have to start to be able to do is to normalize this conversation. Um, and when I say that, I mean, what's happened to me in my experience more often than not is that we tend to talk about people of color and the LGBTQ community as these two separate and distinct entities. And the problem with that is that it absolutely erases those of us who stand at the intersection of those identities and so many more. And we find ourselves having this I'll speak for myself, I find myself sometimes having this internal conversation and battle, trying to figure, well, am I supposed to be extra gay today? Or am I supposed to be extra Black today? Am I supposed to code switch? Am I supposed to show up a different way? And part of that is because we just have not figured out how to normalize this conversation and really insert our narratives into part of this narrative as the community in its entirety. And this is not to say at all that racism does not exist within the queer communities. I think that's something we need to acknowledge readily. There have been many a study that have chronicled dating apps and the things people say on a lot of queer dating apps, which I won't repeat here, but just know that it exists. But I think the crux of that is that we're now at a point where we're hearing the cries of groups like me and like many others who are really seeking to be recognized and seen as human beings. Right. So that's the first thing we have to start to do is just understand that we are here. Like we are standing on the legacies of Marsha P. Johnson and Sylvia Rivera, right? The foundation of this movement. But what I want us to do is to make sure that after this, we start to really focus on the hard part. I think a lot of people are thinking that the hard part right now is we are confronting many of our own longstanding internalized biases and assumptions about one another, right, or about other people in the world. But you should know that is not the hard part. Right? A lot of people are just now seeing what a lot of people have been experiencing for years and years and years. What's going to be the hard part is not only figuring out how to change your own individual behavior, but really the structural and institutional changes that have to follow. And when I say that, what I mean is we have to start and continue to push for protections for all of these groups to be enshrined in the law. And this means that we are adding explicit protections for sexual orientation, gender identity, and gender expression in regulations that are including, but absolutely not limited to, housing, healthcare, and family planning and financial services, where I sit. And in all of that to coincide with the recent victory around employment, because let's remember, it was only up until 2 weeks ago, you could still be fired. And I guarantee you it will still take some jurisdictions some time to actually begin enforcement of that in the way they should be. Um, but what will define us going forward is not at all the things that we're seeing right now, but it's going to be the many, many changes that we have to make and the things that have to take place when the news cycle is over. So when your company's not in the public sphere, what are the actions you're taking? How are your behaviors changing? And that's what's going to truly define us. That's going to be the hard part. But I welcome the opportunity now for us to start building these coalitions, to start recognizing one another for all that we are worth and so much more, and to start making some substantive changes here. So thank you.
Okay, thank you, Ulysses. And Shauna, we'll now hear from you on the road, sort of like Charles Kuralt.
Thank you, Reverend Ken, and thank you also for setting up this forum. I know that a few weeks ago, whenever we were discussing what to do for Pride Month, it was days after George Floyd was murdered, and that was very fresh on all of our minds, and just extremely intense and very sad for many of us. And so we were going back and forth and trying to figure this out, and this really seemed like the forum that needed to happen. I am actually coming back from Houston, Texas, or from Dallas, Texas, sorry, after taking care of a family member there. And I was raised in Houston, Texas, and somewhat like Ulysses had mentioned, ended up telling my parents and my family that I was gay whenever I was 19 years old. And for the Southern Baptist family, it definitely did not go over very well. And it was interesting because I felt like over the past 25 years that I have been living as an openly gay person, that things have definitely gotten better. My wife and I met whenever I was 19 and she was 21. And I feel like, each decade brings us something new. Whenever we tried to start our family, there were definitely struggles with that. I think, sometimes things that are very much so taken for granted whenever straight people go to get married or start their family. For us, it meant for each child that we had about $4,000 worth of legal papers that had to be filed and done to protect our families. In order for me to get on my wife's insurance, that did not happen. I was a stay-at-home mom and couldn't get on her insurance. And it's stuff that I think many people just take for granted because they don't necessarily face that struggle. As I mentioned, whenever I was traveling in Texas just a few days ago, one thing that I thought was really distinct was the fact that probably around 20% of the people that I came in contact with were wearing masks. And it was interesting to me because I can honestly say most people of color in Dallas, Texas were wearing masks. And I thought, for me, that was just very telling about, for one, who really senses that they're not going to be served if they are in fact infected with COVID, and who is really taking those extra precautions to make sure that they are protected. I probably saw about 4 white people that were wearing masks. Of course, if I could, I would have gone in a full hazmat, outfit. I had the gloves, the mask. I definitely look like someone from New York, but I digress. But I think the one thing that we've seen over the years is that the fight for marriage, the fight, as Ulysses mentioned, even just 2 weeks ago, to be protected so that our employers can't fire us for being who we are. My wife is an Asian American and our kids are half Chinese. And, I think there have been times that I've definitely feared, especially with COVID right now, the comments that'll come up whenever we're in public. I'm very glad that we're talking about race and the LGBT community, because I do see, especially for my family, that we are definitely intersecting, different facets. And the reality is that there's a lot of hatred and bigotry that's directed towards both. And so thank you again, Reverend Clark. Ulysses, it's an honor to be on the panel with you as well as Legislator Corman. So thank you for inviting me.
Certainly. Thank you, Shauna. Annie, the floor is yours. I should say the platform or the screen.
The Zoom floor. Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Clark. And I'm honored to be speaking here with Ulysses Smith and Shauna Black. So today I wanted to talk a little bit about my history. And so I'm going to be turning next month 59. And when I was growing up and in my late teens, early 20s, and realizing that I was gay, it was a really hard decision whether to actually live that life or not, and or to live a lie. And because at that point, it was a choice between, at least as I saw it, and as a lot of people my age saw it, was about being able to have a family. And so I chose to be true to myself, but that choice actually meant not having children, and at that time thinking that I could never get married. And even though I grew up in a very as you said, as I described it myself, homophobic and racist family, still family was very important. And even when it was a very abusive family. And I remember child services taking us kids away from our parents at one point. And even as horrible as it was, we just wanted to be back together. And so having that togetherness is so important. And even sometimes it's like I said, as horrible as it can be to lose what you do have. So I really want to thank people like Shauna and other people in Ithaca for the Ithaca 50 who were brave enough to help pave that way so that I could get married. And I've been with my partner for 20 years and we're married now. And that's something that I do not take for granted. So I really want to thank the people that helped pave the way for that. So there's a lot of stuff that's been going on over the past 50 years, and 51 years ago, this year marks the Stonewall Uprising, which really helped galvanize the modern LGBTQ liberation movement, as Ulysses mentioned a little bit. And also June 2020, I can't go by without mentioning this. It's 4 years since the Pulse nightclub massacre in Florida, where 49 people were killed, 53 people were wounded, and most of those souls were Latinx. And this month marks, again, two more trans people who were Black were killed, Rhea Milton and Rem Mia. And last week, as Ulysses also said, the Supreme Court ruled for increased protections for us in the workplace, and that is huge. But each time something like this happens, I don't want to forget where we've been, and a lot of people have been challenging me as far as whenever I post things about LGBTQ specifically. Recently, a lot of family have challenged me when I've posted things about Black Lives Matter, like, well, that's the past. And so if you say the past, it's, well, for two things. One thing, we need to remember the past or we're doomed to repeat it. And secondly, it's not the past. The Black Lives Movement, LGBTQ rights, all of those human rights and more are things that we're struggling with right now. We are so far from having equal rights, and we can't sweep it under the carpet. And so for people like us, that all four of us on this panel that are activists and speak out, we need to keep doing that. And we need other people And I think that's one of the great things that I'm seeing from the Black Lives Movement now is that everybody's coming out, or at least a lot of people. And it's not just those people that this movement has affected. So I want to just close with one of my favorite passages from Pastor Martin Niemöller, that first they came for the socialists and I did not speak out because I was not a socialist. Then they came for the trade unionists and I did not speak out because I was not a trade unionist. Then they came for the Jews and I did not speak out because I was not a Jew. Then they came for me and there was no one left to speak for me. So these issues that we're talking about today are not just our issues, they are everybody's issues. And I think one of the big things that I'm learning from this and what I've learned from my life is that we all need to stick up for each other. Everybody does. And not just as the various groups, but everybody. And if we don't, we need to do that for ourselves, for our children, for our neighbors, for the children and parents being held in, I call them camps because they've come from Mexico or other countries. So we need to speak up for everybody. So thank you.
And thank you, Annie, and thank you, Ulysses and Shauna, for your comments as well. We are now, I think about what you have said, each of you have said. I mean, it makes clear that we are indeed talking about a real human rights struggle. We're talking about the dignity and worth of human beings. And I think that, that is, what is framing what we are seeing, what we've seen in recent weeks globally, what we are seeing in terms of the advocacy for equality for the LGBT community. And that and this is the direction in which persons such as Dr. King and Malcolm X were moving toward the end of their lives and expanding what had been a Black freedom struggle for civil rights into a larger human rights struggle. And we have a much more expanded understanding of what the human rights struggle is in these days, in the 2020s. So we want to now provide a moment for questions from the audience, and we are looking forward to your questions and comments. Okay, we do not have questions as of yet, but so we would encourage those of you who are part of our listening audience to please submit your questions so that our panelists might be able to engage you.
I see one question there now.
Okay, let's see. How can LGBT persons and Black people properly corporately address the violence that we are experiencing in our communities, the killing of transgender women and Black men and women?
I wonder if they meant corporately or cooperatively address. But we could address both.
Sure, I would say let's take this. Take this up.
So I'm happy to start the conversation here and start with what my thoughts are. Being raised in the South and with a Southern Baptist family, I can definitely attest to the fact that my family was very racist. Some of my friends were very racist, and the one thing that I thought was extremely important especially as I grew older and I grew to have friends that were Black, that looked different than myself. And every time someone said a racist comment, it was hurtful to me. And it wasn't to that person's face because it was always a cowardly racial slur. But these were people that were in my lives that supported me and that I loved. And other people that I loved were mocking them and saying hateful things. And the one thing that I learned was that whenever I told them how it affected me and that it not just upset me, but that I wasn't willing to tolerate that type of conversation, and I wasn't willing to be part of the conversation, and that in fact my relationship with my parents and my grandparents and my other friends that were being racist, whenever that was on the line and jeopardized, and I put it like that, I noticed that the conversation stopped happening around me. And I think, that's just one, I call it a little thing that I found myself doing that I think is effective. And another thing as far as the LGBTQI support in our community is that I think some people that have never been around people like me don't understand that we're just people and we're just trying to be happy and live our lives and have families. And sometimes it takes I have uncles that are very much right wing. They love Donald Trump, and and it took me telling them that I was gay and then meeting my wife and my children and loving them for them to realize that they've been homophobic their whole life and that's how they were raised. And I'm not saying that's an excuse, but I think for them to realize that, what, I love you and I love your family. And to put those feelings of being scared and disliking a group, sometimes I think there has to be a connection there. So for me personally, I think as far as getting information out there, and if you hear someone speaking hate, to really call them out, as especially as a white person, and say, what, you're not going to do that around me, and it's hurtful to me and it's hurtful to the Black community, and I'm not going to listen to it. So I think that's our obligation.
Andy, did you want to add to that? I spoke first, so I was trying not to speak first again.
No, go ahead, please.
Go ahead, Ulysses.
I agree with you, Shauna, and I think when we think about the hallmark of humanity, one of the best things about us is the ability to be empathetic, right? And so absolutely, we know this is an issue of human rights overall when we're speaking about the violence against queer people of color, against the LGBTQ community at large, against Black people at large. But there's something so much more powerful about individuals being able to say, I might not be part of that group, but I definitely understand this feeling of exclusion. And I understand what it's like in some respects to be targeted or to be singled out or to not be a part of something. And to be able to say that and be empathetic, and then to say, I don't want anybody else to have to feel that same pain or that same hurt, and I'm going to do my best to help facilitate changes, is something that I think we should all really take part in and relish in as people. I think we, both folks in Ithaca and myself here and in the bubble of the Bay Area, we live in these areas where it can sometimes, not to say that there are not difficult things that happen or terrible things that happen, but we often have this privilege of seeing our legislators and seeing the folks in power here be able to promulgate and put forward relatively more progressive policies than in some other places. And let's not forget, right, that that's not necessarily the reality for so many other people who find themselves in these circumstances now. And so I think, if we're looking to answer how we do this cooperatively, it's one, really, really doing the work, taking the time to do the work to understand your own biases, your own assumptions, your own identity and experiences, and figure out how that has been shaping your interactions with other people and your perception of other people. And then really do some digging and understand the history that's here, understand how and how we've gotten to this point, right? Why people have been excluded from so many things, legislated out of participating in so many opportunities, and why people are responding in the way that we're responding right now, right? I think that's the first thing you can do if you want to get on this journey of doing things cooperatively as groups. We have to understand, you have to be able to see the world with the lens of somebody else for just a second and build that sense of empathy. On the corporate side, right there, that's always a touchy one, especially kind of with the conversation around the corporatization of Pride Month overall. But that's not to say that corporate entities don't have agency, right? And I think we have to acknowledge that in this society, especially in the context of the United States, most of our corporations have a lot of agency. And there's an opportunity for agency to use the voices that they have for good. I think a lot of companies are already seeing that over the last few years, people are, especially employees, are way more willing to voluntarily self-identify themselves in ways that they typically would have not done in the workplace years ago. They are very open about being abreast of current events and how they are processing those current events in the workplace. And it's become really unrealistic for any employer to tell somebody to go process that at home or to not bring that into the workplace, because I don't surrender my Blackness when I walk in the door every day or open the Zoom these days. And nobody surrenders being a parent. Like none of those things, we don't cease to have those identities just because we go to work. And so corporate entities actually should be using the agency that they do have, not only selfishly to retain their employees and to support them, but also just to help make the world a better place. And I acknowledge that there are a lot of companies who are doing many great things now, and a lot of messages that went out in support. But again, some of those things can be very performative, and where you have to ask yourself: are you here for the moment, or are you here for the movement, right? Because the movement now is not just putting out the statement; it's saying, well, let's really take a critical examination of the product or the service that we're putting out into the market, and what the impact of said product is, and how do we actually leverage that agency or leverage our platform as a company to be able to facilitate some structural or institutional change, right? That's a conversation we're having at Blend, right? Where our work has been to digitize the mortgage process and ultimately all of consumer banking. But we have to understand that our customers are banks and credit unions and financial institutions, and we sit at the intersection of the financial services industry. And so there's real opportunity here. And the conversation we're having now is, okay, well, let's actually start to talk about structural discrimination in financial services and what that looks like. So how can we be advocates for alternative data sets in underwriting, right, to get away from the FICO score, which we know is structurally discriminatory, right? So how can we build something alternative into our data model and help advocate on the regulatory landscape to facilitate some of these other changes, because it's not just us, it's going to take a whole bunch of other entities doing that. So there are ways that corporations can take part in this. It can't be just the messages. It's really about focusing on the actual policy changes, some of the actual structural things that are in place as well. So that was a little long-winded, so I'm going to stop there, but hope that answered the question somewhat.
Okay. Great, thank you. We've got several more questions that have come through of late. Annie, I don't know whether you wanted to respond to that initial question or before we move forward or not.
I wanted to just add that I really like what Ulysses said about, are you here for the moment or the movement? Because I think a lot of times I see people like out at these protests, that are standing with me that weren't actually there for other things, like that weren't there for pushing for affordable housing, for instance. And that actually stood against and spoke out against affordable housing, and I'll call it out, in the village of Trumansburg. And so this is part of that, and you can't just separate one thing. You have to see how every single thing is connected. And so you need to listen to people, like a lot of people that when I talked about before about saying, well, affordable housing affects everybody, and it often disproportionately affects, people of low income, people, single parents, people of color. And people said, oh, so you're calling me a racist. and I'm saying, no, I'm not calling you a racist. You know, I'm asking you to look at how this affects other people. And we need to try and keep saying that, even though people, that would have been, you know, a time where I could, okay, I'm going to be quiet and I'm going to stay out of it. But no, we need to keep saying these things and not let the uncomfortable conversations scare us away. And I just also want to add of having more people at the table, which is also, I believe Ulysses and Shauna were speaking to that. Maybe they didn't say that exactly, but thinking about who's not at the table and having maybe, not maybe, but more meetings and just somehow figuring out how we can intersect, not just these groups intersect in our goals and our movements intersect, but actually figuring out how to make them intersect even more. Because I think, again, working together, we can do a lot of different things. So actually doing that in our movements and not just talking about it today, but keeping that up throughout the year.
Mm-hmm. A question has come to us. Who are some of the LGBTQ activists that you look up to? Who would you recommend following in the Ithaca area?
Annie Corman.
Yeah.
That's a great question. I mean, I actually remember being 19 years old and in college in Texas and reading Leslie Feinberg's book, Stone Butch Blues. And it was, you know, it was very eye-opening. And, you know, as someone that's just coming out of the closet, like having someone, you know, who was abused physically and sexually and like tell the story. I mean, it was just, it was very eye-opening. And I think both Ulysses and Annie have mentioned, like, look into the history. Like, there's so much history that certainly in Texas I didn't hear about. And it's not in your textbooks, but you have to actually search for it. And, you know, hearing about things, I mean, Annie and I are even in a different generation and we compare notes, and it's, you know, it's interesting for us to like hear the fight. It's interesting for me to hear the fight that Annie had, because I feel like with each generation, it gets, I want to say that it gets better, and it, you know, I'm hoping that it gets easier. But I think a big part of that is really looking to the history, and you know, the Stonewall riots. It was you know, that's a big part of our history, and it happened. You know, that started kind of a revolution for LGBT folks.
Other responses?
I think the Ithaca 50, I mean, there are lots of folks, Shauna Black, Larry Roberts, you know, there's lots of folks that put themselves out there for that. There's also people locally, Claudia Brenner, if you haven't read her book, Eight Bullets. So it's called 8 Bullets, and that's a really riveting book about her horrendous time that she went through and how she came out of that, and with the help of friends and family. And I just wanted to mention, as folks here said, about sometimes it has to do with movements, like I'm involved in Finger Lakes Pulse, and then other times it's your everyday thing. I remember, I don't know, maybe 20 years ago, I was at the Michigan Women's Festival, and Leslie Feinberg was there, and she was at a little encampment across the road from the festival. And because her and her partner were not allowed to come into the women's festival. And so there was all these workshops around at the festival. So I did an impromptu workshop and just talked about, like, so if we're narrowly defining a woman, you know, what does that do? You know, how do we feel about that? And And I just thought a few people would come, and there were 50 people that came, and we had a great discussion about it. And then we decided right then to do something small, we thought, but it turned out, I think, to be something big, is that we went across the street and we asked Leslie to come into the festival. We paid their way, and we surrounded Leslie with 50 people, 50 women, and we walked her through the middle of the camp. And she didn't want to stay because she felt unsafe. But we walked her through, and I can't remember, we did some chants, and people came around, thousands of people came around and cheered us and cheered Leslie and walked her through, and then she left. But it just felt like, everything you can do, especially in the moment, to challenge things that you see. Don't let it go. If you can do some little thing, and then there's years that go by that I forget that happened. But, each little thing that you can do means a lot to get the conversation going, and to have people like try and reframe, something of, geez, I'm always used to doing things this way, or we're having this. I mean, there's a challenge between, specificity and then welcoming and being more inclusive. So it's not cut and dry. There's no one way that I could tell you that there's a way to do it, but we need to have the conversation.
Mhm, mhm. Here's another question for us. Do you think that the level of animus we're now seeing against people of color, LGBTQ people, and women is the last gasp and backlash of white male supremacy in America?
Go for it, Annie. I saw you. Right. Or Shauna.
Where to start with this? I mean, I think it's one thing, but I mean, it's not just the white, yeah, it's not just the white male supremacist. It's I mean, I see the stigma, quite honestly, even in the Asian community. Like, you see, like, sometimes the Koreans don't like the Chinese, and so it's not just, I just don't think that it's necessarily white supremacy. I think, quite honestly, having a president that, and I hate to get political in these forums, but I think I have to, having a president who has a following, and while it might just be 2% or 5% that are pure white supremacists, I think having a president that doesn't, that tolerates that and accepts that, says a lot about the acceptance of that movement. And if we actually had someone who said, you know what, I don't want your Confederate flags at my rallies. I don't want you supporting me in your KKK hats. Like, we don't have a president that does that, though. He loves the support, and he brings it right on and welcomes it. And so, I think it starts quite honestly from the top. And as far as the hatred and the white supremacy, I think that's it's suggestive, and there is perhaps a part of it, but I think it's just overall hatred and bigotry, and I think that can happen with any population.
Yeah, my answer to that question is no. I don't think this is like the last gasp of air, or the breath of people who are losing power. Because the premise of that question, right, means that there has been enough structural or systemic change, right, even as of late, right, that has resulted in the dismantling of white supremacy, or a certain group losing power. And I shouldn't even frame it as a zero-sum game, but more so other people actually being put at the table when it comes to making decisions and being treated as humans. And so, no, I don't think this is that last gasp of air. I think the level of animus you're seeing now, right, is the same that's always been there. It's just now it's in the public eye to a degree that a lot more people have not seen before, or have willfully chosen to ignore. But there's no refrain that's being stated now that has not long been stated for years and years and years at this point. So this is not new. Like I said earlier, this is not the hard part. We haven't even gotten to the hard part yet at all. We've only started talking about acknowledging and becoming aware that bias, prejudice, racist behavior actually still exists. Right, that it still exists, and getting people out of this mindset of, yes, we elected a Black president, and that automatically made us a post-racial society, which is just bananas to me that we are still holding on to that anybody's still holding on to that notion. So no, what's going to have to happen, like we've been talking about, is there's going to have to be a lot of actual changes in some of the institutions that we probably hold the most sacred in the United States, right? Because many of those institutions were built on the ideology of white supremacy. And to be clear, we are all susceptible to the ideology of white supremacy. This is why you see, and even within the queer community, you'll see many people distancing themselves, many other groups of color, like Asian individuals, et cetera, distancing themselves from a lot of Black folks because they see the treatment that Black folks get, right? And they see that it's not necessarily what's accepted. You still see a lot of queer Black folks who are in the community, oftentimes, who, while many times want to stand on their own, still feel like they have to, go get the glistening gym body or whatever it is, just to even be seen, right, in the community and be held to that same standard. So, no, there has to be actual change in not only the law, right, in general, but we will have to see how decision-making structures actually change in this country. You're seeing some municipalities start making some decisions, but I mean, there's a long, long road ahead of us. And when you have true change, right, that you will see actual more representation from all of us, from folks who look like us, and that change in power. But at this point, that's not what's happening, right? This is just a period of discomfort for a few people, but it's going to get way more uncomfortable before we actually see that change.
Well, racism and sexism and homophobia have proven to be quite resilient. They are prevailing forces. But I think there are many people of goodwill, including those on this panel, who are being the countervailing forces to those prevailing forces, and as it should be in a society that lays hold to democratic principles. At least, certainly on paper. We have to also make those, reality as well. And going to the heart of one of a part of your response, Ulysses, in terms of structures, there is a question. Can you talk about the structures in our local government that perpetuate racism and homophobia? What can we change to get at the systemic biases in our own government?
I'm going to turn to the local folks for that. So, as I'm assuming that was Ithaca specific.
Sounds like it.
Can you repeat the question? I didn't hear all of that.
Okay, sure. Can you talk about the structures in our local government that perpetuate racism and homophobia? What can we change to get at the systemic biases in our own government?
Well, it's a question. I wanted to say it was a big question, but it's not a big question, actually. It deserves a big answer, is how I want to respond to that. So there's a myriad of things that this can fall under. So for instance, our social services, our police department, how we support housing, food deserts, food justice, jobs. I mean, there's just civil rights. There's just so many different aspects that this can come under as far as government. I do want to just mention two things that I thought of during this discussion is, and people mentioned people who are Asian, and we had at our last Workforce Diversity and Inclusion Committee people from the Ithaca Asian American Association come and speak to us, sorry, about the harassment and violence that they've been encountering since the pandemic, since some people are blaming it on people of Asian descent. So just wanted to acknowledge that, and we need to stand up. And that's just another example of we can't let them, some of them I know are not wanting to speak out because it's scary, but we need to stand with them and figure out how to help them. I want to acknowledge that for the Tompkins County government that we are hiring a chief diversity and equity officer, and we just put that job posting out. So I know there's a lot of people on here from different organizations that I see, and so please share that information. So that's one of the things we can do. And part of it, I would say, I don't know what there is to do. So we're getting help. We're getting experts in that because I personally don't know how to look at that. I know one of the things that a small thing, but important thing that we've been looking at is when we're having furloughs and who's coming and then phasing people back into work, like looking at which populations, what are the demographics of those people, because we have to always be mindful of that for everything. And as people know, COVID has exposed a lot of the disparities that people didn't see before. But I'll let other folks answer this question also.
Reverend Ken, I have actually been very, very happy with the county's response. There was we do resolutions, and some of those are just feel-good resolutions, and we certainly passed one. If there's a resolution to pass, we'll pass it. But there was a lot of conversation around that resolution, and amongst legislators, amongst administration, on how can we not just pass a resolution that feels good and sounds great in the media, but how can we act upon that? And I was
Okay, Shauna, we kind of lost your audio. Could you repeat? I think the last thing I heard was that you were moved by something. Okay, it looks like we lost Shauna's audio, at least for the moment. Oh, Ulysses, go ahead.
This is the only thing I want to add to this particular question is more of a resource than anything. There's a really great reading by Fred Pincus from, I want to say, published in 2000-ish. But he talks about, he's focused on the 3 levels of discrimination. And I think that is a really helpful kind of foundational piece, just so people kind of understand, if you're, because I think we're all throwing out institutional, structural, and they're valid and important. And it's just really important that people actually understand what those mean. And so the institutional is really, this is when we're looking at intentional policies that are, or laws or regulations that have been put in place to exclude groups or at any point that have the intent to cause harm or disparate treatment. But that's very different from structurally discriminatory, from the structural level of discrimination, because those are the things that we like to label as colorblind or gender neutral or things like that, that the intent is absolutely objective, and they're possibly seeking to correct some historic injustice. However, they typically still end up with disparate impact on marginalized groups. And so again, the FICO score is a really good example of that, where it's like, let's put in place some sort of objective criteria to assess somebody's creditworthiness, but we're actually not going to account for the fact or talk about how we legislated these groups out of participating in employment and educational opportunities that would have actually gotten them the same benefits that would lead to them being creditworthy. So there are many other examples of that, but I think it would be helpful just to color that conversation that a lot of the things that will have to be challenged will not be things that are so overt and in your face, and are an overtly labeled racist policy on them. You're not necessarily going to see something that is very Jim Crow-esque. You're going to see things that are going to have to require us to take a very hard look at our institutions to see, well, what have been the impacts of X policy on the groups that are in our communities. So that would be the lens I would say to view that through.
I agree with that. I mean, and I think, a lot of dealing with racism, particularly as it relates to microaggressions, has to do with the subtleties. Subtleties that can sort of render themselves either quasi-invisible or they sort of operate under cover of language, which really covers up the actual intent. And in many cases too, I mean, one of the issues that we have in terms of dealing with issues as racism, sexism, homophobia is the outcome of policies and procedures over against the intent, which in many cases the crafters of these things don't intend this outcome, but this outcome emerges that is detrimental, and that has to be addressed. We've got a couple of more questions as we have about 4 minutes left in our program that I want to get to, and I may be able at best to get to one, maybe two. Do you advise people to share their sexual identities when applying for a job and wanting to understand resources available to them? Is there a risk here?
Well, I'll answer quickly. It's always going to be risky for anybody to voluntarily self-identify themselves in any way, right? But I will say, one, you now have employment protections against that, although that doesn't necessarily, you're not clear that extends to the applicant process just yet, versus a post-employee. But most organizations actually don't ask that in the applicant stage. But if you do choose to disclose it you could always ask kind of, I don't want to say roundabout questions, but ask other questions to just say, well, what are the resources that are available here for various groups, whether that be LGBTQ specific? Do you have ERGs? What are your policies? You can ask those questions without necessarily outing yourself, just to understand the landscape of the company. More organizations than not, however, they're typically are going to be, I'm living in the bubble of Silicon Valley right now, so it's a little different for me. But most of the companies I hear are pretty okay with that in the applicant process. So do you see this?
I think it's also. Oops, I'm sorry.
No, go for it.
I think it's also a matter of what people are comfortable with. Like in my early 20s, and this was 20 years ago, of course, I wasn't comfortable with myself, and I also wasn't comfortable with my community accepting this. And, at this point in my 40s, it's essential that I work for an employer that values that values me. And so I think if the person is comfortable expressing whom they are in the interview, you can get a good glimpse kind of an employer and the response. And maybe it's not going to be a good fit. If you realize there's resistance there, you know what? Maybe it's just not going to be a good fit with you and them. And everyone should be supported in the workplace. And so it kind of just goes back to your comfort.
Other responses?
I think it's, of course, absolutely up to the person, as far as like risks. There's always been risk, less so nowadays. I mean, when I was younger, there was no way I would have even thought of that. And I worked some jobs for years and never outed myself. So I think nowadays I think it's changed in some ways that you could think of it as Shauna said, is that the right place for you versus or am I going to fit in here? So it kind of, you could kind of like think about a shift, not only where you're going to work, you know, are they good enough for me, and so to speak? Are they, do they have the resources? Do they have the policies that are going to support me and other people? And sometimes I've gone into places and tried to help make those where they weren't there. So that's another way that you could look at it. Depends on where you are in your life and how you feel about that. I've pushed for that. Sometimes successfully, sometimes not, sometimes pushed back. And I remember, for instance, one job I was telling Sean about yesterday I didn't realize it till recently that when they were trying to tell me to dress in a certain way, I didn't realize it till just now, they were trying to tell me to dress more female. And because I'm more gender neutral in the clothes that I wear, or a lot of times I wear clothes that to me that are comfortable are in the men's section. And I have had a blue collar job as a home inspector. So I'm wearing Carhartts and things like that. And so, you know, sometimes you can get, and it's not just about for jobs. I would say that's also when you're going and buying things, whether are you feeling comfortable? Are people looking at you? Do they have an inclusive environment in the store? So I think we should use this as power that we have. And so, for instance, with the tourist industry here, they found, I'm trying to remember the right numbers. It was something where when they did a survey locally for Tompkins County, it was somewhere between 12 and 15% of the people that visited here identified it as LGBTQ. Actually, I think it was closer to 20%. And I can tell you that if those people said that, even on a survey, the numbers are actually much higher, because even on a blind survey, there are going to be a lot of people who don't even want to put it on there. So I think claiming that as power, as I guess whereas I would kind of put that, rather than thinking, you know, am I going to be worried about being here? It's like, are they good enough for me?
Well, Annie, we're going to let you have the last word on this. I apologize that we were not able to get to a couple of questions that were submitted, but we are very, very grateful for the contributions that you, Annie, and Ulysses and Shauna have made to enriching our discussion and understanding in relation to working for racial justice and for LGBTQ plus justice. And this will be a continuing conversation. There will be more, we will be having more programming of this sort, addressing these and other issues coming up, in particular through this format of Zoom, until the time in which we're able to meet in person. That may be a way off, but we want to thank all of our panelists and all of our participants who joined us in this program today. And we want to end our conversation here as close to our end time. And really appreciate what you've contributed, all of you as participants and panelists, to our discussion today. So thank you all very much. And we look forward to seeing you again in the future for future programming on Zoom. We're just going to ask our panelists to stick together for a few more minutes as we close out our program. Thank you again.
Thank you, Dr. Clark. And thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.